A repossessed Bugatti Veyron sat in a workshop with a transmission that refused to move. Drive did nothing. Reverse did nothing. The car simply sat there, engine running, going nowhere. The previous owner had already been given the official verdict: replace the entire gearbox, a bill running well into six figures, somewhere around £300,000. Rather than pay that, the car was handed back to the finance company and eventually sold off at a steep discount, treated as a write-off before anyone had actually opened the fuse box. Then a YouTuber with a toolbox and a stubborn refusal to accept the official story bought it, spent a short afternoon tracing the fault, and solved the entire problem with a part that costs about the same as a sandwich. And this was not the first time he had made Bugatti's official position look shaky. It was the second. To understand why this story detonated across the car world the way it did, you have to understand what a Bugatti actually is and why a transmission failure on one of these cars is treated so differently from a transmission failure on almost anything else. The Veyron, when Volkswagen's Bugatti division launched it in the mid-2000s, was built to be a rolling engineering flex. A 16-cylinder engine arranged in a W configuration, 4 turbochargers strapped to it, and an output north of 1,000 horsepower at a time when most production cars were nowhere close. Bugatti was reportedly losing money on every single unit sold, since the manufacturing cost dwarfed the eye-watering sticker price. Everything about the car, including how it gets serviced, was designed around the idea that you do not improvise. You go to Bugatti and Bugatti tells you what it costs. That philosophy extends directly into how the dual-clutch transmission is handled when something goes wrong with it. Bugatti's service network does not, as a rule, open the gearbox casing and chase down a faulty component inside. Officially, if there's a fault inside that unit, the entire gearbox gets pulled and replaced as one sealed assembly, no exceptions, no partial repairs. It is a policy built on the idea that an assembly this complex shouldn't be tinkered with piecemeal, and on paper that sounds like a reasonable, even responsible, approach to protecting an extremely expensive and extremely intricate machine. In practice, it means the diagnostic process can skip straight past the cheap, obvious stuff and land directly on the most expensive possible outcome. And that is precisely what seems to have happened to the previous owner of this particular Veyron, who was quoted a gearbox replacement before anyone had apparently checked something as basic as a fuse. Enter Mat Armstrong. If you follow the Supercar side of YouTube even casually, his name needs no introduction. He has built a channel and a reputation around buying wrecked, written off, or financially abandoned exotic cars and bringing them back from the dead, usually for a fraction of what the official channels would quote. Lamborghinis, Ferraris, Porsches. He has worked through plenty of them, and the pattern is always the same. Don't trust the worst-case diagnosis until you've actually looked for yourself. His audience has grown into the millions partly because every video reinforces the same satisfying idea that the official story and the actual story are not always the same thing. Armstrong's history with Bugatti specifically started before this Veyron ever entered the picture, and it's worth knowing that backstory because it explains why Bugatti's leadership was already watching him closely by the time the Veyron drama unfolded. Months earlier, Armstrong had been pulled into helping a friend in Miami, content creator Alex Gonzalez, who had bought back his own crash-damaged Bugatti Chiron Pur Sport from a salvage auction after it had been written off following a stunt gone wrong. Rebuilding a car at that level outside of the factory is an enormous undertaking on its own, but the situation escalated when Bugatti effectively blacklisted the car's VIN, meaning no official dealer would sell the parts needed to put it back together unless the work was done in-house at the Molsheim factory in France. That decision turned a private repair project into a very public standoff, and it eventually pulled in Bugatti Rimac's own CEO, Mate Rimac, who addressed the situation directly on social media rather than letting it play out in silence. Rimac's response at the time wasn't a simple dismissal. He pushed back on some of the cost claims circulating online, arguing that a lot of what people were saying about Bugatti repair pricing didn't reflect reality, and he raised genuine safety concerns about non-factory repairs on a car with the structural and mechanical complexity of a Chiron, going as far as suggesting parts of the chassis might need to be separated to do the job properly. He also left the door open for the car to be fixed at the factory itself, just not by an independent garage using cross-reference parts. Armstrong, for his part, didn't back down from the project, and openly admitted he was a little startled to learn that Bugatti's own leadership was paying close enough attention to his channel to respond to it directly. That entire saga, parts blacklist, public statements, a CEO weighing in, set the stage. It established that Mat Armstrong wasn't just another car YouTuber Bugatti could ignore. He was someone capable of generating enough noise that the company felt it had to answer him. Which brings us to the Veyron. Armstrong picked up this particular car as his second Bugatti project, a repossessed unit sold at a noticeably reduced price specifically because of the transmission fault that had scared off its previous owner. On paper, it looked like a familiar trap, a car worth real money, sitting dead because of a single component that the manufacturer insists can only be replaced as a complete, enormously expensive sealed unit. Most buyers would have looked at the same quote the previous owner received and made the same decision to walk away. Armstrong didn't walk away, and true to his usual approach, he didn't start by assuming the worst. He brought in outside help, specifically a specialist named Ricky from RE Performance, who could plug into the car's onboard diagnostic system remotely and start running tests on individual components rather than guessing. Think of it as the same basic idea as connecting a phone to a laptop to see what's actually misbehaving inside it. The car is covered in sensors. Those sensors report back to a central computer, and the diagnostic tool reads that stream of information component by component. The early tests were unremarkable. They tried activating the car's secondary air system and got no response at all, a dead end that didn't immediately point anywhere useful. Then they turned their attention to the hydraulic pump responsible for building pressure inside the gearbox, the component that has to do its job correctly before the transmission will engage any gear whatsoever. The diagnostic readout claimed the pump was firing exactly as it should. Standing next to the actual car, Armstrong heard nothing. No whirring, no building pressure, none of the physical signs you'd expect if a pump that size were genuinely running. The software was reporting success, while the hardware sat in total silence. That kind of contradiction, a system logging a command as successful while nothing physically happens, almost always traces back to one of two causes. Either a sensor is feeding the computer false information, or the electrical signal simply never reaches the part it's supposed to power. And when a command leaves the computer correctly but never arrives where it needs to go, the first thing any competent mechanic checks is the simplest possible point of failure in that circuit, which is usually a fuse. A fuse, for anyone who's never had to think about one, is a deliberately weak link built into an electrical circuit. It's designed to fail before anything more expensive does, sacrificing a thin strip of metal so that excess current doesn't reach and destroy a wiring harness or a component further down the line. Every car has dozens of them tucked into a fuse box somewhere under the hood or inside the cabin, and replacing one typically takes less time than it takes to read this sentence, at a cost of a few dollars or a few pounds depending on where you buy it. If Bugatti's official diagnostic process had included pulling that fuse box and checking each fuse individually before recommending a gearbox swap, this entire story simply wouldn't exist. But that step appears to have been skipped, deliberately or otherwise, in favor of going straight to the sealed unit replacement that the official policy defaults to. Armstrong asked Ricky to keep monitoring the diagnostics remotely while he physically located and opened the fuse box himself, checking each fuse by hand since he didn't have a labeled diagram to tell him which one controlled what. Most of them looked completely normal. One didn't. It was visibly melted, the metal strip inside it long gone, clearly blown out at some point in the past and never properly replaced. What made the discovery even more interesting was the rating of the fuse that had been sitting in that slot. It was a 40-amp unit in a housing style that doesn't normally come in anything close to that rating, since the standard sizes for that type typically top out well below 40 amps. That detail matters because it suggests someone, at some point before Armstrong ever got near the car, had been chasing a recurring electrical fault the wrong way. If a fuse keeps blowing, the correct response is to track down why the circuit is pulling more current than it should. The far easier, far more dangerous shortcut is to just keep swapping in a bigger fuse until one finally stops blowing immediately, which is exactly what the evidence pointed to here. Someone had likely worked their way up through several ratings before landing on the oversized one that held just long enough to mask the underlying issue, right up until it too eventually failed completely and left the car stranded. With the dead fuse removed, Armstrong and his team ran a basic bench test, Feeding 12 volts directly into the circuit by hand to confirm the pump itself wasn't the problem. The moment they did, the pump came alive, audibly building pressure for the first time since the car had arrived in his workshop. He then fitted a properly rated replacement, sourced from an ordinary high-street auto parts shop for the price of a coffee, and ran the test again. This time the pump behaved exactly as designed. It built pressure, reached the correct level, and shut itself off automatically. Armstrong climbed into the car, pressed the shifter, and felt the transmission engage. Park, reverse, neutral, drive, every gear responded properly. A car that had been sitting motionless, carrying a quoted repair bill in the hundreds of thousands, was now shifting cleanly because of a part that cost less than a tank of fuel. That fix didn't mean the car was finished, and Armstrong was upfront about that on his channel. A blown fuse rarely happens for no reason, and his own diagnosis acknowledged there was almost certainly a deeper fault feeding excess current into that circuit in the first place. Further inspection turned up damaged wiring near the gearbox pump itself, scorched and brittle from sustained heat, along with a persistent engine misfire and a radiator with a slow leak. None of those were cheap or trivial to ignore, but none of them carried anything close to a six-figure price tag either, and crucially, none of them required tearing out and replacing the transmission as a whole. The single component that the manufacturer's policy treated as an all-or-nothing, sealed unit, £300,000 proposition turned out to be perfectly salvageable, just buried under wiring problems that any independent specialist with patience and the right tools could chase down piece by piece. Online, the reaction moved fast in both directions. Plenty of viewers treated it as further proof that manufacturer repair policies on hypercars are built around maximizing replacement part revenue rather than minimizing actual cost to the owner, especially once people started connecting the story back to Armstrong's earlier Chiron Pur Sport saga and Bugatti's history of locking vents and gatekeeping parts. Other commenters, echoing concerns Rimac himself had voiced months earlier, pointed out that fixing a fuse is a world away from safely diagnosing and repairing a structurally complex hypercar transmission long-term, and that one lucky fuse swap doesn't necessarily disprove the broader argument that some Bugatti repairs genuinely do require factory-level expertise. Fellow Bugatti owner and YouTuber Mark McCann, who has his own Veyron project, publicly reached out after watching the fix, apparently curious whether the same cheap fuse trick might solve a similar issue on his own car, a small moment that underlined just how directly this story was landing inside the niche, but closely watched community of independent supercar owners and restorers. What makes this whole saga land so hard isn't really about Mat Armstrong's mechanical skill, even though that skill is real and well documented across both projects. It's about the uncomfortable question it raises for every other Bugatti owner who doesn't have a YouTube channel, a specialist on speed dial, or the willingness to crack open a fuse box themselves. If a sealed unit replacement policy means the official service network jumps straight to the most expensive fix without first ruling out the cheap ones, how many other cars, Veyrons or Chirons sitting in garages right now, have been quietly written off for a problem that never actually required a gearbox swap at all? Nobody outside Bugatti has access to that data, and Bugatti has no obvious incentive to publish it. What the public does have is two separate, well-documented cases now, a contested Chiron rebuild project that pulled in the company's own CEO, and a Veyron fixed for the price of a fast food meal, both pointing in the same uncomfortable direction. Bugatti's broader position throughout both controversies has remained fairly consistent and arguably fair on its own terms. These are extraordinarily complex machines. Non-factory repairs carry real risk, and a lot of the cost figures circulating online don't match what the company actually charges. That's a legitimate argument, and it isn't dismissed lightly here. But legitimate caution about amateur repairs is a different thing entirely from diagnostic process that appears to skip the basics on the way to the most expensive conclusion available, and that's the gap Mat Armstrong has now exposed twice in a row, once with a blacklisted Chiron and once with a 5-pound fuse. Whether Bugatti changes anything about how its sealed unit policy gets applied in practice remains to be seen. What's already changed is how much harder it's going to be for any manufacturer in this space to assume nobody's checking their math. So here's the question worth sitting with. If a transmission that was supposedly worth £300,000 to fix turned out to be a coffee money fuse, how many other unfixable cars out there are sitting in storage right now for the exact same reason? Drop your take in the comments, and if stories like this are your thing, make sure you're subscribed for more.